Welcome to this Aztlander presentation, Modern Maya Magic, Divination, Thaumaturgy, and Theurgy maintained and expanded by Diasporic Maya communities, with Solomon Pakal of Kaqchikel Maya descent. Enjoy!
Going forward. So, hello everyone. I'm Solomon Pakal. I come from a Kaqchikel Maya background of the diasporic variety. I myself was born in Washington, D.C., and my siblings were as well. My mother comes from Ciudad Guatemala, Zona Siete. She grew up with Caminal Huyu in her backyard, and I believe it was before the mall was built there. And then the rest of my family, for as much as we have known history, comes from the Zacatepeques, Antigua area. Although my great grandmother, she was born before there was birth certificates in Guatemala. She's older than Chiapas State is in Mexico. So there's a lot of missing history. There's a lot of folklore and things, but I've tried my best, and my father has tried his best to try and piece together a lot of those missing parts of history that don't have the strongest of paper trails. But I am surprised and impressed for what we have been able to put today. And I myself have researched and traveled around the Maya world and tried to congregate with other Maya communities and community leaders as much as I can with the liberties I've had when traveling abroad. Now, magic is a very controversial subject just in daily talk, but specifically when it comes to anything Mesoamerican related too, because when we deal with that M word and M words such as like mysticism, manifestation, all these uh, buzzwords, there's a lot of projection that is placed upon indigenous communities, and a lot of that projection can easily run out of control. And it turns out that it wasn't historically accurate whatsoever. So I want to not only dispel some misconceptions, I want to point out some very unknown, for the largest part, Maya magical, if you will, systems that are not as well known, and the ones that we do know, and then what we can learn from cross-referencing all of these. So this is our itinerary for today. We'll go over a little bit of family history, just to kind of orient to shoot our azimuth on the road. I will give you a definition and some examples of what magic is, just for the sake of discussion, just so we're all on the same page of like what I'm talking about. We'll go over the known systems of Maya religion, Mesoamerican religion, i.e. slash magic, of which I actually think academia gives us a good template to kind of go off of, and then kind of expand from there and maybe plug in some nuances that only a practitioner of the culture might know. Let's dispel some pseudo history and New Age things to compare and contrast to equal equivalents or what they might be directly undermining. And then I'll highlight a little bit more of what I do to close out the show. So, Maya versus Mayan. I have this slide because the word Mayan has become a little bit more liberally used in the last couple of decades. And I myself have been using the word Mayan to describe things a little bit more commonly as well. However, I very much in the know that Mayan is traditionally used for the calendar and language. Maya is typically used for everything else. But I wanted to cite some examples of just how this liberalization of the word is being used by experts that actually do know what they're talking about. They are not Billy Carson. They are not Giorgio Tsoukalos. These are like actual professionals and sometimes people of the culture or culture adjacent. So, for instance, the Mayan Wisdom Project is headed by famously by people that have lineage to a very renowned Maya elder Daykeeper named Don Carlos Barrios. And they use that word Mayan to describe Mayan Wisdom Project. Even Dr. Edwin Barnhart, who is the head of the Maya Exploration Center, did a travel show for the great courses called Exploring the Mayan World. And Luke Caverns, who last time I checked was still a member of the Maya Exploration Center, did a presentation at Cosmic Summit 2023 titled Mayan Atlantis. And it's really was used to kind of catch attention, and the public is more familiar with that word Mayan, but it's also just because Mayan in the English language works better as a descriptor and as an adjective for certain things which you're saying. But it's a great knowledge check for your lecturer. If they're using that word a little too liberally, obviously it's a red flag. So I just say this: if I say Mayan at certain times, this is why. I swear I'm not a quack. But what you will never hear me say are the Mayans. Moving on. So a little family history, as I mentioned, Kaqchikel Maya descend from everything that we can surmise. We come from the House of the Bat, if you will. It's really cool to walk into the Cleveland Arts Museum that is not too far away from me, and the Queen of Waka that has that emblem glyph of the House of the Bat is there, because I feel like I'm looking back at an unconfirmed ancient ancestor. But yes, the family comes from Antigua Zacatepecas area, and particularly Zona Siete of La Ciudad, where my mother grew up, and then they later immigrated to the United States. Where they immigrated into the United States, the Washington, D.C. area, a lot of people don't know about this, but there is still a bustling Mexican and Central American population. I know a lot of people are familiar with West Coast indigenous communities, New Mexico, Arizona. There's a big Maya community in Florida, and I believe so in New York City as well. There's basically every community in New York City, right? So, but Washington, D.C. has always had a very, very big Guatemalan and indigenous American presence. And Guatemalans hang out with Guatemalans. So we were able to kind of compare notes growing up in the urbanness of Washington, D.C., and have big family parties and the typical run-of-the-mill big feast of tamales and whatnot. So that's my mom. And this is a family photo of us at Atitlan back in like 1994. And I have my abuela on. Oh, she has crutches for some reason. I don't remember her having crutches at the time. But we come from essentially a lineage of brujas, and I understand we'll get to brujeria as a term in a little bit. My father, he is American, so I'm 50-50, but my family is indigenous as far as we can tell, all the way back. And my father was a historian as well. This is where I get it from. And my father was a military and intelligence veteran as well, and that's where I get it from. And I'm grateful for this mix because it really sprouted the intrigue and the educational opportunities to do further research into our own family history, but just my history in general. Because coming from the culture in Guatemala, in Mesoamerica, it doesn't behoove you to claim your indigeneity. There's a lot of stigmas. I'm sure a lot of people in this awesome group know that there's a lot of stigmas towards indigenous people in the homeland and here, especially in 2025. But if you are loud and proud about indigeneity, you risk limiting your economic opportunities. You risk opportunities for finding a home. You risk being subject to physical violence. So it's not something that a lot of people are proud of. And I'm grateful for my American father who loved Maya culture and loved Maya history. And out of that fascination, it allowed my mother to blossom more into her own culture as well, and to start studying not just cultural interpretations of things, but like academic books and archaeological findings as well. And that carried on to me. So through this marriage, this cooperation of creative forces, if you will, birthed a healthy environment for studying Maya heritage and history. Now, the brujeria and all the practice part. Brujeria is a broad term that simply just means witchcraft throughout Latin America. However, because of this broadness, this paint stroke across the continents, witchcraft and brujeria has swallowed up many indigenous traditions to where they may have had some distinguishment in the ancient past, but because of Christian homogeny, they are just all kind of the devil, right? So when I'm also talking about brujeria, I mean that my family comes from a certain mentality when it comes to all of this unseen stuff. They, for the longest time, and it's still the case in especially urban areas of Guatemala and urban indigenous communities, more of a practical usage of these unseen forces. So specifically tailored to get you out of bad economic situations, move out of bad neighborhoods, make sure your husband stays with you, win a court case. If you're a young buck, maybe get a girlfriend. If you're a young girl, get a boyfriend. So very like practical enchantment kinds of ideas. But that's not in a vacuum. It really shouldn't be exclusive, higher cause or lower cause. And we'll get more into that. But I do want to preface this going forward, because especially my family, I I wouldn't find out till later on that we're actually pretty different compared to a lot of Maya traditions. But different traditions and different families certainly prioritize different modalities of metaphysics. And they certainly had different opinions about culture, territory, customs, and courtesies. The examples are numerous. And as if there was never a Mayan empire, correct? One big misconception. And those differences carried ever since the Teotihuacan Entrada, the disputes between Tikal and Calakmul, and even in the Popol Vuh and the Anos de Kaqchikel, Kaqchikel and the Quiche had their own differences. So to find all of these differences throughout the map of Mesoamerica should not be so surprising, and those differences 500 years later somehow persisted throughout colonial eras. So specifically when it comes to um, diasporic Maya communities, Maya people are getting more educated in a Western sense. The ability to not simply listen to family legends, but to cross-reference these with academic literature has become invaluable. I put this photo of me in the army suit because I am proud to have served my country, and despite all of its latest troubles, um, and I'm determined to help make my country better. This is our land of maize. This is our continent, and I don't want to see it go down the wrong way. But I do bring an analytical approach to these things that you would probably associate more with intuition. I think there's a healthy balance. But there, as I say in the slide, diasporic Maya communities have become more educated and affluent, and this allows primarily those who were born in the United States to return to their culture free of shame, maybe shame that their parents had, but we were free of. Now, if I may be a little candid, I, growing up, did experience racial discrimination. I, and particularly in middle school, went to a Catholic school, and being indigenous and in a Catholic school, it just doesn't mix well. But when they found out I was Guatemalan and not Mexican, they couldn't pronounce Guatemala. They would say watermelon, and they would call me a fake Mexican because I didn't look like Antonio Banderas, who he himself is Spaniard. So I certainly had somewhat of a diasporic indigenous struggle myself. And overcoming that shame was a big personal trial for me. But I say that what helped me overcome it was not just kind of listening to my mother and the stories, but also traveling to Yucatan, Campeche, etc., and cross-referencing that with great academic literature. But because we can do that, a Western education plus cultural intuition equals essentially new magic. And also having the mobility to travel the world outside of one home's country, because especially during the 80s and 90s, we know what was going on in Guatemala. The Maya were restricted in their travel. Even today, they're not necessarily the most affluent, and traveling between borders for some people it may be easy, but if you have a job and a family to take care of, doesn't behoove you to go learn about your culture in Guatemala if you're owning a shop in Mexico. So that freedom allows for greater education. As you can see, here's a relative. This is at Tikal back in the 80s about literacy. And then also more education allows us to cross-reference other religions. And I don't necessarily mean for like magical or spiritual reasons. I mean for as like there's a lot of similarities between, say, Hinduism and Mesoamerican spirituality, and definitely not the same, but it's like, wow, Hinduism, it's an official religion, and they're not persecuted not to the same scale by Christianity and organized religion. Maybe my ancestors should not be persecuted for such things. But the ability to examine primary resources such as ruins, stela, ceramics, and codices, this is not something that people that don't have an education can do. To be Maya and to have an education to look at these things and then discern for yourself, take an archaeological perspective, and then discern for yourself, it is absolutely invaluable. There are some very famous names in this group, and there are Maya people that have read your material, and you may read it one way, but a practitioner of these more unseen arts, they see it as, I'm not speaking for all Maya here, but I'm speaking of the kind of brand that I come from. Those are magical spells, so to speak, and they have been used and practiced with. So I am very grateful for the archaeological community and the anthropological community, because it's helping rebirth certain practices. And I have a picture here of a reemerging lost practice, and Mary Lou Reidinger is here. I am totally grateful because this is a knife that was purchased from Jade Maya that is carved and has the emblem glyph of Tikal. And the jade in particular obviously was missing. And there are certain traditions, so to speak, that are held by indigenous communities that if you just go by a cultural, like you pass the word through from one person to the next person, they'll tell you this is the way we did things. But oftentimes this only goes back so far, like the telephone game can only go back so far. And if it's capped at 500 years, those indigenous people are not going to have a practice for jade, because it was outlawed and then it was lost for the longest time. It was only until Reitingers and the Montago River Valley helped resurface jade. So recently I have seen and been corresponding with some Maya practitioners of how they started reincorporating jade with a brand new fervor into their own personal practices. So, and this is a prime example of a tool that I use all the time for ancestral work. So what is the M word? Let's just get on the same page by what I mean by this. So for the Maya, and for all of Mesoamerica, physical reality and the unseen were one and the same, animism. While magic is a contentious term, the Maya showed distinct ritual procedures that infer they believed they could consciously influence reality through performative means, much like many traditions across the globe. Successors to these rituals continue to this day. To add to this, it is very clear to me that the Maya did not simply perform frenzies of rituals, but they had various systems. Egypt has 120 to 140 pyramids. When I checked 10 years ago, before LIDAR blew up, Mexico alone had around 10,000. You don't build those kinds of structures in that amount in those areas with tens of thousands of people and doing these plaza-wide rituals. You don't do that by intuitive flow alone. You do it by systems, and they did. Like, clearly the mathematical system, the calendrical system, the precision of many of the architectural feats, it's very precise, and that kind of precision demands systemization. So I am not saying that all traditions across the world are equal as far as they mean all the same thing, but there are meaningful points of convergence that I think need consideration. So I bring up two examples here. I was fortunate enough to travel on a State Department mission to India and live there for about 4 months, and I had the pleasure of doing Hindu-based rituals, Jain-based rituals, and Sikh-based rituals at the Golden Temple in Amritsar in Punjab. And let me just tell you from a practitioner standpoint that there are a lot of intangible similarities that are experienced. On the left, I bring this example of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn because they were a group that kind of aggregated many lost practices, or what were deemed lost practices, and tried to make sense out of them. They were essentially one of the modern think tanks of all of these unseen arts. Now, I will address that occultists during the early days of archaeology now have a notorious reputation for projecting such things as Freemasonic ideas onto Mesoamerican religion. And yes, I can tell you from working with practitioners of different paths that that projection does not serve anybody well. It just makes things more confusing. But for all of their faults, their grand takeaway is this: there are esoteric similarities across cultures separated by time and distance that may suggest that there are universal metaphysical fundamentals that govern us all, just as other laws of nature. So the implications here are vast. And again, I want to emphasize, me and if I ever practice with anybody or in the groups that I run, and my family, we most certainly do not mix and match elements from different esoteric paths and cultures. There are those who do, and that is not simply cultural appropriation. It is, but it is also simply operationally faulty. Because it's not a finger paint kind of project. There is a mechanism to all of this. It is a very intangible mechanism, but a mechanism nonetheless. So let me give you an example of what I mean by universal fundamentals, but they don't all necessarily mean the same thing. So everybody here is basically familiar with the Mesoamerican counting system. It is a base 20. The Western counting system is a base 10. Is one wrong and the other correct? No, but you cannot simply plug and play numbers across the systems effortlessly. They must be respected and essentially approached in their own way. Now, can both systems meet at the number 40? Yes. Therefore, there are multiple ways to the same destination. On. Okay. Quick example. This is my combat sports background speaking. Magic is a skill set and not a vending machine. Coach teaches students the highest percentage combination in striking sports, which is the jab cross. Teaches him on pads. He hits it every time. The student goes to perform this in sparring and misses every time and then gets hit in return. Student comes to coach. Coach, I thought you said that this is the highest hitting combination. It did not work. I want my money back because the jab cross does not work. This is silly because it is not accounting for the more intangible X factors, which are a moving target instead of hitting pads. The target hits back. And also the claim that the jab cross doesn't work because it didn't work for him. is neglecting a data pool of sanctioned combat events statistically that suggests the jab cross is the highest percentage combination in striking sports. So their subjective experience is keeping them from seeing the more ethereal factors of the situation. So before we get into the actual specifics of Mesoamerican practice, all of them, including Mesoamerica, are going to fall into three main pillars and like three different styles. The first is divination, which is the practice of seeing knowledge of the unknown, kind of like a bird's eye view outside of your own perception. This is not necessarily predicting hard futures and hard. It should not be a substitute for like intelligence gathering or data collection, but it can be seen as foresight before going into a situation. And there's plenty of examples for this. There's the site seeds that are used by the Daykeepers in the highlands of Guatemala to not just, it's not simply discerning, oh, like, will he break up with me? Or is like, are the Jets going to win on Friday night? It's discerning from a place of wisdom where you are and relative to your situation and possibly the best an array of choices that you can make, for lack of better words. And divination is deep, so if I sound superficial on any of these descriptions, please bear with me. It's a whole presentation. But also various forms of scrying. If you know anything about esotericism, bowls of water would be used to water scry. But there is evidence that, and legends that there's legends from Chichen Itza that the Maya used the entire cenote as essentially a giant scrying disc, particularly at night. And then there are various forms of crystal scrying. This is found throughout many cultures, but the Maya have and still do this. The big one is with mirrors. And we're going to get into a specific site that uses mirrors, but the classic period effigies of deities with mirrors in their chest and their centerpiece. And also a lesser known form of scrying that uses a slab of quartz crystal that Maya midwives would use to kind of hover over a pregnant woman's belly as a form of ultrasound, more or less. The other forms, Thaumaturgy. So thaumaturgy is the practice of performing miraculous supernatural acts through learned techniques and rituals and application of esoteric knowledge, instead of simply waiting for divine intervention. This is spell casting, for lack of better words. This is what a lot of like the brujeria styles and upbringings of urban magic really focus on. But all cultures have it. You could even rationalize that normal people that pray, that are unsatisfied with their current circumstance, even if they believe that God will take care of them, they have enough initiative or drive to ask, and sometimes ask repeatedly, to change their situation. So some examples here are the Kaqchikel. And the Kaqchikel is a very flexible ritual from what I have experienced, where it can be much more about honoring creative forces and honoring ancestors. That is a bit more theurgic in practice. But I will say that the Kaqchikel can also be used for very practical means. And I have had family members that were hired by Daykeepers to perform an auxiliary role to Kaqchikel that maybe the Daykeeper would not like to perform themselves. Sympathetic magic is often gathering correspondences to take on the form of a subject, and then exercises are performed on the subject. So for lack of a better example, I'll just say everybody's familiar with the concept of a voodoo doll, right? But some kind of effigy to symbolize a certain thing. And it doesn't have to simply be that. It's utilizing this idea of correspondence, that everything has a meaning. This kind of brushes shoulders with animism as well. If I hold my hand out like this, there is a ethereal meaning that there's a level of acceptance in this gesture and peace But if I do this, there's a correspondence of defense or offense and a bit of a prickly nature. So even things as simple as that have a conceptual correspondence. And then there's famous bell book and candle style spells and thaumaturgic means. Theurgy is the practice of ritual or spiritual techniques designed to invoke divine presence, facilitate direct communion with the divine or higher forces, and to achieve some kind of dialogue with ultimate reality. This is mysticism. So this is when honoring ancestors in a bit more of an ambiguous way that doesn't have necessarily a divine goal, but is seeking some sort of more fulfillment than what normal everyday life 9 to 5 is. So some examples of this are fasting. And I myself perform a fast that is described in the latter books of the Popol Vuh. I have to abbreviate it because the Popol Vuh advocates for, I believe it's a 7-day fast, a 9-day fast, a 13-day fast, or a 17-day fast. And while I have performed a 7-day fast with all of the productivity I have to maintain in the modern world, I have to squeeze it down to a 36-hour. The practice of keeping the count of days itself can be seen as a form of theurgy, which is honoring that mythological snapshot of time, the Nawal or the Chumil of the day, and revisiting the time in Mesoamerican mythology of which it happened. And then there's various dances. There's the dance of the rooster, the dance of the deer, and the voladores. That this was to give some kind of reverence to the personality of the sun. I actually had a relative who was a voladore, like the eagle dancers that essentially bungee jumped off the poles and swung down. In practice, a balance, because not one of these things solves all the problems, so to speak, or it's not. If this was a diet, you got your proteins, you got your carbs, you got your veggies, and just eating one purely is not necessarily holistic for the metaphysical biome, especially thaumaturgy. I'll tell you, coming from the urban brujeria scene in Washington, D.C., I've seen a lot of people. Some people made it out of the neighborhoods and whatnot. But it was typically because the people that made it out of those kinds of bad neighborhoods where MS-13 and stuff were running amok. It was because they found some sort of theurgy and they used divination to kind of seek some wisdom. But I have seen a lot of people, brujos. They get way too much into the practical stuff, and it becomes very corrosive on themselves. Yeah. So some known Maya systems. Here we have 2 images. I'm not going to spend too much on these because there's a bit more information available on these 2 figures that are here, but I'll go ahead and touch on them. Also, these are more syncretized figures. And I want to touch on where the future may be for Maya practices and Maya systems of spirituality and magic, because the more primary resources and the more we uncover from pre-Columbian sites and artifacts, we don't need to necessarily go to syncretized sources if we don't feel like it, which, being of native descent, there is an inherent desire to decolonize my practice, to decolonize, and when I mean decolonize, people coming from my background and stuff, we've had very bad experiences, racial discrimination, religious discrimination, and we don't necessarily want to identify our most intimate parts of our spirituality with the conquistadors kind of caste religion for us. Doesn't mean that we can't live in peace with people that do find fulfillment that way, but on a personal level, it may not be psychologically healthy to just find a syncretized way to the Christian cross, more or less. So here are two figures. Famously on the right, we have the figure that is known as Mashimon, with millions of followers in the US, Mexico, Guatemala. And I want to specifically highlight the works of Michael Groff, because Michael Groff's paper on God El, while there are many personalities, cultural heroes, and entities, pre-Columbian entities that have been kind of attributed to Mashimon, I find that his paper on God El quite comfortably traces Mashimon back to the pre-Columbian character known as Ekchua. So me and my family, I don't know, the green light's kind of dimming things, but my practicing altar here has spirit masks, and we'll get more into that. But one of them is for Ekchua. If I know the original name of Mashimon or San Simon, I do feel a bit more inclined to just go to the pre-Columbian rendition rather than to kind of quasi-Catholic the thing. On the left, we have San Pascual Rey, or San Pascualito Rey. The legend goes that there was an outbreak in a certain city in Guatemala, and this figure came, and as if the town uptook the figure as a patron, it would clear out the disease. And this was San Pascual Rey. Fun fact, San Pascual Rey predates the very, very popular Santísima Muerte by at least 150 years. And there have been scholars that have quite comfortably traced the pre-Columbian origins of San Pascual Rey to the various skeletal death entities that are mentioned in Maya mythology. San Pascual Rey also, in the west of Guatemala, there have been some remains of rituals found around riverbeds that have actually used the pre-Columbian, almost like codicy depictions. Maybe they were printed off by like a computer or they were drawn, but they even there seems to be a desire to go back to like the pre-Columbian renditions because they know of the pre-Columbian renditions. Whereas in the past, and maybe in the past, like before the dawn of the internet, it was simply the syncretized version. So here are some traditions. As I mentioned, just as there has never been a Mayan empire, there has never been a monolithic Maya religion. Customs and courtesies and priorities differ across Maya regions and subcultures. Sometimes to the point where Maya from different parts of the Maya world don't even, they just don't know about certain practices across a border or across a land barrier, maybe across mountains, rivers. So famously, there are the Daykeepers in the highland of Guatemala that prioritize maintaining the Cholqui calendar. And I would say that to a kind of like a baseline, they have a much more theurgic way of operating. As I mentioned, brujeria is a bit more thaumaturgic in its kind of baseline way of thinking. And again, brujeria is not the actual pre-Columbian way of saying it, but it was just what developed and how they labeled it throughout the colonial era. But if we go to the west of Mexico, in Chamula, the San Juan Chamula Church in Chiapas, the Tzotzil Maya prioritize something very different. Now, they seem to have a understanding of the sacred calendar because they will do certain services and masses and rituals every 20 days, and they operate on 20-day cycles, but they're not maintaining the calendar in the same way that the Daykeepers are. That church is very interesting because there's not just a litany of candles, but there's a litany of mirrors that they maintain as the staple tool in their practice. Giant mirrors as altarpieces, but also figurines, syncretized figurines of the saints with mirrors embedded in their chests, just like classic period patron deity effigies. So this is an example of a surviving legacy. And there's also Shamula is famous for the professional criers, the posh liquid, as essentially a substance to reach some sort of altered state. Maybe not in the same way that the billionaire tech bros on Wall Street want to try ayahuasca and have a trip. It's much more, in a way, it's a bit more visceral because the Tzotzil believe in a very rare cosmology of there must be a certain amount of suffering in the universe. So that's why these criers are essentially making up the debt of the suffering that must take place. And then on the far right, very close to my heart, I am a big fan of the Khrushchev Maya. I have a few friends in Belize that are of the Khrushchev Maya path of spirituality. And the Khrushchev, you look at the Maya cross and you immediately think syncretism. But what the cross really symbolizes is the pre-Columbian cross, which is the Yashche, the sacred saber tree, of which all the four corners spread from. But it's embodied by that center direction color, Yash, which would it translates kind of to blue-green. This is where we get the color of jade from. It's also why I have the green lights on. It's because, and I'm wearing a jade piece, and I've got the Jaguar God of the Underworld wearing jade because it's very important. It's a cosmological, it's a very amazing cosmological significance. And the Khrushchev Maya, I love their cosmology. I've had a lot of great talks with a few people from there. But I'll give you an example of like how indigenous people can be out of the know with certain Maya or indigenous lingo and customs and courtesies. I have been a part of panels that do focus on decolonizing or people that come from a Latinx associated background. And that term decolonizing is it's a loaded term, because you talk to some people that may come from the north of Mexico and they have no problem saying the word mestizo. And I didn't have this problem really either because I grew up in the United States and I didn't really have a visceral reaction to that. That wasn't really what I was called. I was called fake Mexican, as a racial slur. But I ended up using this word mestizo with a Belizean Yucatec Maya friend, and he was very polite to let me know. He's like, we don't really respond well to that term. And I had known about the caste war, but I did not know just how much of a visceral, systematic oppression machine that the mestizo caste was bottlenecked into by the colonial era governments, that they would systematically oppress their own people that they descended from. They were essentially used as wardens and enforcers on the Belizean Maya. And I was very ignorant of this. And I'm glad I was humbled by my friend here, because it just like cultural immersion is a very hard thing. Take it from somebody who has been deployed on behalf of the U.S. government to win hearts and minds in places like East Africa, North Africa, South Asia. It can be a very oblong experience of like what you know, what you don't know. And this is a culture that I have relevance to. It's Belizean Yucatec Maya, and I come from Guatemala Maya. But that's how the differences are. That's how deep the differences are. And again, I've been a part of these like panels that were on decolonizing and kind of like minority rights, and they did not know that mestizo could be considered basically a racial slur, and would be very offensive if they said it in the wrong parts of Latin America. And that's not their fault. It's just you don't know what you don't know. So I find a lot of cultural misunderstandings and cultural appropriation things simply a lack of education. But I'm a big fan of the Khrushchev Maya. I love their cosmology. It has a lot of similarities to my family's. It's not exactly the same, but it's very, very amazing. So I'm going to shed a little bit more light on my family system, and I'm still investigating it because I find it to be very, very unique. So we have these are some pictures of, except the far right picture. These two middle pictures are actual personal altars. And the one on the far left is a ritual I had done with a group of people. And we have a big emphasis on spirit masks. And masks, big tradition throughout all of the Maya world. You can find renditions of masks everywhere, tourist traps, but not just tourist traps. You can get them custom made. These masks here were made by Efrain Getz, who lives in Yucatan. He's a family friend. He's awesome. And they are essentially conduits for spirits. And I will dive a little bit more into how to define those a little bit more. But a lot of my practice centers around that, spirit masks, as essentially a central kind of hub and feedback mechanism for engaging in ritual. Something else that's really prioritized is the candle stuff that we do. I have found even before my family immigrated to the United States, it was very, very different than what I found candle work to be in the Daykeeper tradition. I found typically that Daykeeper styled candle workings utilize the Kaqchikel, where they do these bundles of candles and they kind of throw it in a big bonfire. Whereas my family prioritized, and like the kind of people I grew up around prioritize these more focused and modular styled candles, where you could dress them, you could equip them, you could layer on various correspondences through a variety of methods. If you look at that candle, it is not simply the candle that's layered, it's the glass of the candle that's layered with correspondences. It's packed with certain herbs, and then there are even layers on the plate of which it's standing on. What's interesting here is that this is a ritual that I had done with the hero twins of the Popol Vuh. And if it's strange, but if you look at the picture, for some reason, I've never seen this before. There are two flames in the candle. Whereas like the flame, it's not like a candle that has two flames on the left and right. There was a flame floating on top of the flame, but with a space in between, if you look at the picture. So I mention here, and I wanted to point out the vase of the seven gods. It's known as the vase of the seven gods that was found near Naranjo. Because I always wonder, it's like, we're Kaqchikel ethnically, but from what I've been able to surmise, a large majority of the Kaqchikel population these days actually kind of falls in line with the Daykeeper tradition. But that was never really prioritized by anybody in my family. But what was prioritized were these like weird little jingles. And my abuela used to have like weird like little almost like little proverbs from the culture. And they were always, I don't want to say always, but there were some that were very like they had to do with the planets. Like the moon walks with you. That's what they said to my mother. Like the moon will follow, the moon follows you, the moon walks with you. The planets will never lie to you. Things like that. And for the longest time, it's usually in Mesoamerican studies, it's like Venus, and that's it. But I would later read the books of Chilam Bilam. And the books of Chilam Bilam have a very, very in-depth, again, I'm reading this as a practitioner, like to a scholar, they might not be able to draw much from it, but at least not at first glance. But there is a specific portion of Chilam Bilam that talks about a planetary styled ritual. And what I mean by planetary, I mean by what Western occultism would call the seven traditional planets. The moon, the sun is included, Jupiter, Mercury, Venus, Saturn, I'm missing one, Mars. Those are the 7 classical ones per Western occultism. So when I read this, the first proposition in Ralph Roy's translation is that there's a lot of Western astrology packed into there, or like clearly like this is a colonial era rendition. Like they're just kind of the Maya Chilam is throwing Maya stuff on Western things to just kind of get the priest to look away, more or less. Well, I took a look at this, and being well versed in Western esotericism myself, the numbers don't match up. And what I mean by this, most notably, the number of the sun. Basically, the 7 planets, if you will, have number correspondences. The sun has the correspondence, in particular, this is the best, the most standout example of them all. But the sun has the number correspondence of the number 4. And this is very well known that in the Maya glyphs, in the classic period glyphs, that the sun was associated with the number 4. In fact, the face glyph for the number 4 is the quintessential sun deity. And whereas in Western occultism, the most widely used and understood number for the sun is 6, not 4. 4 is attributed to Jupiter in Western occultism. Again, the mainstay, like the typical practice. The other thing is that I find it very hard to believe that Catholic friars that are trying to force convert very esoteric native priests to Catholics, I highly doubt they're going to share any kind of astrological or occult knowledge with these native priests. So I beg the question, is it pre-Columbian? Then I found the works of Timothy Knowlton and Raphael Gerard, and their exposés on not just Chilam Bilam, but in particular this certain chapter of Chilam Bilam that talks about this planetary ritual. It is in the Ralph Roy's version. It is called the Ritual of the Angels. However, Raphael Gerard translates it as the Ritual of the Creatures. And what is being depicted, Knowlton goes line by line, is essentially the apotheosis of the Maze deity, or the Maze personality, and how he rises essentially from death to become this, how he does it, similar to how he does in the Popol Vuh, after the hero twins defeat the Lords of Xibalba. And it spoke volumes to me, and then I applied it. And it is, I feel, this is just me being candid, I feel that I am certainly tapping into a missing side of my family when performing a rendition of this. And no lie, like, there's no doubt that the names associated with the creatures of the planets are some kind of strange amalgamation that the Chilam was using. But it is not simply Spanish, and it's not simply Maya. It is a very, very, without going too deep into esotericism, it is a brand new but functional thing. But I would argue is very authentically Maya. And then Knowlton and Gerard are able to cross-reference this ritual and how it was maintained even throughout the 1600s by Spanish accounts. Certain Maya farmers would perform such a ritual, that it may very well correspond to what is known as the base of the 7 and 11 gods in Naranjo. Because there's one with 7, because there's one with 7, which are those 7 traditional planets, and 11 found in Naranjo that account for constellations as well, not just the planets. And ironically, that those 11 are also mirrored in the ritual of the creatures and the ritual of the angels, if you will. So Gerard and Knowlton both are propose that this ritual and this planetary regard, the Maya regard for the planets, is pre-Columbian. It's not fully deciphered. And I think Alex Krim is in the crowd. I want to thank him because he's doing a lot of great tracing work for the vases, and it's helping us understand my a new level of my esotericism, and also very close to my heart, my family's heart. I didn't plan on going that deep into the ritual of the creatures, but I find the discoveries to be pretty compelling. So, as I mentioned, academia, I believe, for as secular as academia is, actually gives us a good template to go off of to start mapping out what Mesoamerican practice is in a systematic point of view. So, first and foremost, the one that is often addressed is deity worship. And the word deity and God is a slippery slope because the casual understanding of that word is essentially an X-Men character in the sky. And that couldn't be further from the truth, not just for the indigenous framework, but for the pagan framework of that word deity basically across anywhere in the world. That they're not simply superhumans in a Marvel movie, but they are these personalities of forces of nature. They are living concepts. And when I have had discussions of what my experience and the findings of these figures are with religious studies professors that specialize in paganism and a study of all paganism from across the world, we come to very similar conclusions that perhaps the Maya and all of Mesoamerica had more of a something closer to a Neoplatonic regard for what deity and God would mean. Some kind of divine personality that was essentially a personable version of a force of creation. Some kind of more tangible asset that was embodied a form of creation. This is echoed quite descriptively in the Popol Vuh, where the figurines of Awilish, Tohil, and Hakawits are essentially in like little figurine forms, and they're complaining to the Quiche, saying that you need to carry us on your backs because we could be stolen by warriors. So very much something that requires an effigy. Now, I personally, because I study various forms of religion and historian, I've traveled the world, I don't necessarily have a problem with that word God or gods or deity or some kind of polytheistic worldview. But I do understand the hesitancy behind it. And I do understand that if you set it to the majority of the population, that they're just immediately going to jump to kind of comparing it to the mainstream Christian conception of God, right? Which is a very limited understanding. So I am trying to propose that we use a different word. And I believe that this is something that my family's has adopted, but it originates from the Belizean Yucatec Maya. You heard me raving about the Khrushchev earlier. The Belizean Yucatec Maya have this word yumsil, singular, yumsiles, plural, and that's the more kind of like hybrid Spanish version, or yumsilob for plural, which is this plurality. It's almost like it bridges traditional polytheism into pantheism. It's a much more ethereal and experiential experience of vocabulary. Another good example I want to bring up is that when people are talking about African diasporic religions, particularly that of West Africa, the divine figures from that pantheon, if you will, even people that are not very familiar, but they are somewhat familiar, the knee-jerk reaction isn't to call those figures gods. They might, in their head, register as such, but it's not the knee-jerk reaction. the knee-jerk reaction is to refer to them as orishas, a more indigenous descriptor of those figures. So I am proposing that when we are talking about Maya deity worship or anything that is a, portraying a divine personality, that we do show it respect by replacing the word deity that comes from deus, right, and a more colonized worldview to Yumsil and Yumsiles and Yumsilop. And I think specifically for people coming from the culture, it's very healing, for lack of better words. So some examples of how that is practiced. There's this idea of mounting or spiritual evocation. Academia also lists ancestral veneration as a form of Mesoamerican religion. Now, that's not simply honoring relatives. I do that. I've got my abuela with a glass of water on a bookshelf. But it's also, if we can take a cue from the classic period monuments, clearly the rulers, the Ahaus, were regarded as some kind of divine quarterback, essentially, of the city-state. And that would also fall into that, because ancestral does not simply mean to be related or somebody who's passed. It means that it denotes some sort of humanity, whereas Yumsil, or something of that deity variety, may have never been human. It was a force of nature to begin with, and it will be a force of nature when it ends. Whether it ends or not, that's a whole nother discussion. But ancestral, Kaqchikel Pakal, Lady Six Sky, these are ancestors. They were human. Time worship. Time worship is obviously maintained by the Daykeepers, but a more thaumaturgic use of time worship or time magic is astrological timing. There are certain days that you do certain things, or you do certain rituals or certain invocations specifically associated with a kind of result. Animism. And again, these are academia's categorizations, but I find them very helpful. Animism. Animism is not simply everything has a spirit. It's to suggest that everything has a metaphysical corresponding. I gave that example of the hand, but this also goes into the people of maize. So that maize is essentially related to us. And that even any kind of material substance has a metaphysical quality to it. Shamanism. Shamanism, there's many different forms. There's many different, I guess, ways of practice. The ones that really stand out, I think, for the Maya have to be that of Nagualism. The idea of a person's animal coessence, or their duality, is sometimes how it's called. This practice is maintained in actually a lot of brujeria, or what they would call brujeria. But it is actually very pre-Columbian, and the evidence of Maya rulers turning into their Nahual is depicted in multiple sources. But I, as a practitioner and lover of Maya systems, as my ancestors have clearly demonstrated with all of their achievements, I find that approaching, now again for practice, this is like when you're practicing, further systematizing other modalities is actually very helpful, because it provides focus. It provides specialized mechanism for inducing some kind of result or change or interaction. So I would include geospatial worship as a form of Maya magic or Mesoamerican magic. This begins with the four corners and their correspondences. Now, you could chalk this up to, it's just animism. Well, you could just say everything is animism, because animism is so broad. But for the sake of specialization, I would argue that the Maya had a specific regard for geospatial phenomena. And this is the beginnings of how they explored physical dimensionality. linguistic worship. This is using the hieroglyphic system as a correspondence, and this is confirmed by the powers of speech that are described by the creative forces when they're trying to create human beings. Humans have the gift of speech and writing, which differentiates us from the animals. And we are supposed to have some kind of relationship with the animals, obviously, as per the creation myth, but as the wood people and the mud people did not. But we are to use our linguistic powers, more or less, responsibly. I would go so far to argue that life is not the rarest thing in the universe, that the ability to make art and to speak and to write is, because there may be animals out there, but to have have civilizations that can do these things, it's rarer. So, in a very deep philosophical sense, I think the authors of the Popol Vuh, the original mythology, dating back to pre-classic times, they were certainly onto something. Energetic bodies, and I'll get to this in the misconceptions area, is that there are authentic indigenous American traditions surrounding a biometa energy. It is typically known as Koyopa or Ishkoyopa, and it has to do with the joints. And this has nothing to do with Vedic systems. I also break down, I specifically focus on the idea of narrative worship or narrative magic. There's basically a lot of folklore from the colonial era is a product of this, where certain figures that have pre-Columbian roots take on a new personality of their own. I have this cute icon of a person in a banda suit or a mariachi suit because El Sombreron is very big in Guatemala. El Charro Negro in Mexico. This is a spirit of the crossroads, essentially. Sometimes called the devil, but it's really not. It seems that this is an entity or a person is a folktale of somebody who actually encountered the pre-Columbian Mashimon or Echua and made a deal with that. And then they became the quote unquote devil's debt collector. But this spirit of the crossroads is very pre-Columbian. You find various spirits of the crossroads. But even La Llorona is an example of this. The Ixtabayop or Ixpuch is traced in the Popol Vuh, in the latter stages of the Popol Vuh, where two females are tasked with seducing the gods of the Quiche. And I want to tip my hat to Dennis Tedlock because in his endnotes, he does a fantastic job of tracing the paper trail from La Llorona to these two figures in the Popol Vuh. And their names, Ixpuch and Ixtabay, this is probably where that figure, Ixtab, comes from. And then also, but I would also add that there are classic forms of this folklore as well. Really, any ascension to the throne that is justified through mythology would be essentially a controlling of narrative. And you might be like, Solomon, well, they're just making things up. I think narrative control certainly has a sway on geopolitics in 2025, and it certainly did in the classic period. I think it is a force of nature. I would argue that it is a very powerful force of nature because narrative control suggests that you don't even have to tell the truth in your narrative to have power. The last form that I break this down into is cosmological structures. The easiest example of this would be the three worlds kind of model, but you find in-depth maps of the afterlife or a grander universe at large in Mesoamerica. The Mexica had pretty vast map of the greater universe and the afterlife. But upper world, middle world, underworld, this is stuff that is maintained across Mesoamerica. And how someone would interact with this kind of modality is using the techniques of journeying that are found in shamanism. And journeying is pretty ubiquitous across a lot of what would be described as shamanic cultures, but the Mesoamerica still has it today. Okay, so you can't talk about the good without addressing the bad when it comes to Mesoamerican spirituality and religion. Now, I can only touch on so much here. Like 25% of my upcoming book that will be released next year is tasked with dispelling misconceptions and cultural appropriation, but we'll get through this really quick. Um, since it's International Chocolate Day. So, we all know Ancient Aliens, right? Bad stuff. But Ancient Aliens, Tsoukalos can trace this back. We can trace it backwards to some pretty nefarious characters. Ignatius Donnelly, actually, I believe, is probably the one that's most credited with a lot of the antediluvian, Aryan, Atlantean narratives. Shockingly enough, he was a U.S. congressman, and he used his work to justify manifest destiny with this kind of stuff. But books like the Antediluvian Age, the destruction of Atlantis, Ragnarok, or the Age of Fire and Gravel, these are all colonial era documents that were meant to dehumanize native populations to make it easier to take their stuff, take their people, take their land, and so on. And this is also where the very inaccurate proposition of the Olmec being an African civilization it comes from. And ironically, despite the attempts at Afrocentric empowerment from those narratives, Donnelly is very racist towards Africans in that as well. Whereas he suggests that Aryan Atlanteans settled the Americas, but they had black slaves, and that the Native Americans were so inferior that the Native Americans actually worshiped the slaves of the white Atlanteans, which would be the Olmec heads. This narrative, again, was to justify manifest destiny, global colonialism, racial superiority, and later genocide of all indigenous peoples, including Africans and indigenous peoples of Southeast Asia. So that is the legacy of Ancient Aliens. We'll go over some of the biggest, the non-negotiables of what must be cleared up when it comes to Maya spirituality. So New Age spirituality directly undermines authentic Maya traditions. So Hunabku, over here in the corner, is one. And you'll see I have a tapestry of it. And I'm going to explain why. First of all, it is one of these things that is so ubiquitous it's hard to escape when you're trying to look for Mesoamerican anything, like art. But there is a very strange quality about Hunabku that I think needs to be addressed, that bashers of it, bashing is certainly deserved, but there's more to the story. Hunabku was not an original form of indigenous unity or monotheism. Hunabku was invented by Spanish friar Antonio de Ciudad Real for the Motul Dictionary, and he had the help of Maya translators to kind of make new words in the Maya language to colonize the Maya, to help convert them to Christianity, and to revise their own history, to say that it was always there, that Hunabku was always this god there. So they were being force-fed monotheism to convert the Maya to Christianity. New Age figures, most notably Jose Arguelles, would push this certain symbol. Now, let me just say this, though. As a historian, being indigenous, history is complicated. So I do not outright bash any figure, even of the New Age variety, because as we're going to say, I believe what Arguelles did was wrong, but there are actual Maya elders then and to this day that do perpetuate culturally appropriated and inaccurate New Age beliefs that not only are they whitewashed, but they're Nazi in origin. And they simply may not know that they are Nazi in origin, because that is the state of things in third world countries, is a lack of education, a lack of resources, and poverty as a motivator to keep up what drives sales. So I actually have a little bit of respect for Arguelles because nobody complains about Aleister Crowley making the Thoth Tarot, slamming the Western correspondences with the I Ching, and then kind of calling it a day. Where Arguelles goes wrong is that he really pushes it as Mayan. And he would use it to suggest the symbol of spiritual unity. So the image origin, it's actually a pretty long and convoluted history, but here's the gist. Common argument is that it's not Maya. It is much more influenced by Mexica and Zapotec geometry. Originally, it was not a circle, and it was from Oaxaca. And it was not black and white. But you do find a similar zigzag image at Uxmal. And the same kind of zigzag image that you find at Mitla in the Zapotec in Oaxaca area. So Arguelles reshaped it to look more like the yin yang. That's what can be surmised. And passed it off as an ancient symbol for New Age purposes. Ironically, though, and this is me as an esotericist speaking, I speak in symbols, and our ancestors clearly spoke in symbols. Ironically, Arguelles redeems the symbol. Unknowingly, he redeems the symbol. Why? Hunabku was pushed by Catholic priests without an emblem to get the natives to stop saying the divine collective duality. This idea of cooperative creative forces spawning the universe. You notice in the Popol Vuh, when you're reading the beginning, it's these pairs of creative forces, the maker and the molder. The sovereign and plume serpent, Ishmukane and Ishbiokok. There are pairs, even the hero twins. There's this concept of duality that's found in Mesoamerica. This idea of push and pull, kind of like electrons and protons, things that are found in nature, like triceps and biceps, back muscles and chest muscles. This is something that our ancestors saw permeate throughout nature, is this contrast, even like a harmony of asymmetries. This is what the concept of duality is. The Catholics wanted to snuff it out so that you have to stop saying divine he and she to where it's just a divine he, and that gets you closer to saying, God the Father. So it was to directly undermine the concept of duality. Ironically, and while it is still wrong to kind of appropriate the yin yang, right, onto Mesoamerica, the concept of the yin yang is duality. And to this day, Maya priests, there are Maya elders who do give seminars. And when they are giving these seminars, oftentimes they will have to use verbiage like a yin yang, because there's just no better way to describe it. Especially like when you're talking through layers of multiple languages. So ironically, Arguelles does redeem in a really weird roundabout way. Takes it from the Catholics and the Spanish, from this divine monotheism and this idea of divine unity, back to the Mesoamerican roots, which is duality. I think we as Native people really have to reconcile what happens with Hunabku, because a lot of people, I don't have it tattooed, but there's a lot of people that do, because it was just the times and people did not have the education. And in a weird roundabout way, conceptually, it does speak to the concept of duality. However, I do understand the hesitancy when it comes to the symbol. And I will actually provide in the next slide a better pre-Columbian expression of such. So I'm going to talk about this one because this is the biggest craze in the Maya cosmology today, or the Maya spiritual space today. International Chocolate Day. Ceremonial cacao is not an ancient Maya ritual. It is a culturally appropriated trend that was started in 2011 by Canadian New Age figure Keith Wilson. In my book, I go through a big paper trail dispelling all of this. But he is on his own website. There's a video testimonial about how he even consulted anthropologists, and no Maya people were using it for some kind of shamanic ritual. It was a drink. It's a drink that is regarded similar to Flor de Jamaica, Marañón, horchata, coffee. in Guatemala. In fact, I think Marañón is typically regarded higher than cacao. But definitely in my household it is. In pre-Columbian times, and we can see in the murals of Calakmul, it was clearly used, but in more of like a diplomatic sense, just like how modern diplomacy is kind of negotiated over scotch or coffee, and not some kind of shamanic journeying tool as it has been advertised. But I do not want to alienate cacao because is there a metaphysical regard for cacao in the Maya cosmovision? There is, but it is not meant to be treated as such as that, because that would the reverence of cacao in this cacao craze is directly undermining the sanctity of ishim, or corn, because atol is another beverage that we have, and atol is what we are made of. It's the most holiest of the crops. That Ekchua was also regarded as essentially this patron of cacao. But again, no cacao ritual. However, there kind of is one. And I say kind of because it's technically a sacred crop kind of ritual. And it's where a lot of these cacao crazed individuals, they go wrong. They've heard of this thing called Ish Cacao, and they call it a goddess. It's not, but it is a spiritual correspondent. And I scratch my head because all of these people pushing the ceremonial cacao and are apparently doing some kind of shamanic rituals that have more in common with things that are depicted with ayahuasca for some reason. They're not doing the actual ritual that is depicted in the Popol Vuh that involves Ish Cacao. Ish Cacao, again, is not a goddess, and I want to be clear about that. Ish Cacao is not some secret, like, uber worshipped deity. And I think to prioritize it is to really undermine the rest of the Maya cosmovision. For example, Hunahpu is mentioned over 64 times in the Popol Vuh. Ishkik, the mother of the hero twins, is listed at least 35 times, I believe. Ish Cacao is mentioned once in the entire Popol Vuh. So it's not this big repertory figure. It was the embodiment of, it was also translated as Lady Currency, because cacao was a currency. And it just needs its rightful place on the altar. And like, I use cacao as like an offering, and Daykeepers use it as an offering as well. You throw it on the kotzi, you throw it on the fire. It's an offering, but it's not a substitute for theurgy. But Americans with money like hot chocolate. So that's why there's a big cacao market right now that is highly inauthentic. And however, the thing is, to ignore cacao would be silly. It is an actual superfood. It has antioxidants out the wazoo, has more than goji berries and blueberries. And it particularly has a lot of healthy qualities for women and their biological cycles. So I think as natives, we do need to reclaim cacao, but in a rightful way that isn't advertising as this shamanic excuse for religion. Now, moving on to, I have this visual here. I have nothing against chakras. I have really nothing against curanderismo. Curanderismo is actually legitimately an indigenous healing art. The earliest known text that scholars can trace curanderismo to is the ritual of the Bacabs in Yucatan. But the 2012 era had booming tourism, and you had curanderos that were running temazcals and beating drums at Chichen Itza, and it became really an eclectic art around that era. So it's not only appropriating Maya stuff, it's appropriating Vedic culture as well, because it was just simply very sellable to Western audiences. This directly undermines Koyopa, or Ish Koyopa. Like, we have an actual energetic system that is native to us. But because chakras are popular, that's what is advertised and that's what is taught. And people think that it's indigenous Maya, which it is not. again, I have a lot of respect. I've trained with curanderos in Yucatan. There's a lot of great ones. However, this the idea of it's an eclectic practice has been used as a cop-out to sell more products and services, especially during 2012, because tourism was at an all-time high. Moving on to this fellow in the corner, the crystal skulls. This one is particularly concerning to me because this one has been adopted by Maya elders. So it started with the Mitchell Hedges skull, but several studies, most notably with the Smithsonian, and it was displayed on that show Expedition Unknown with Josh Gates. It disproved the claims and confirmed 20th century metal tools were used to carve these quartz stones. The quartz isn't even native to Central America. It's from Brazil. And these kinds of skulls, they were floating around flea markets and stuff in Great Britain at the time. This was early antiquities. This was 1910s. Very Wild West when it came to archaeology. And Mitchell Hedges, he wasn't an archaeologist. He was just kind of an adventurer. And again, it was the Wild West. There was no archaeological sites. You could kind of just roll in. So he found that in Belize. Been disproven. But New Age and indigenous elders, some indigenous elders, not all, but there are sadly some very notable ones, have pushed them as legit using essentially a reverse of the Aryan Atlantis narratives to assert an indigenous superiority. These narratives, they certainly took a cue from the Movimiento Confederado Restaurador de la Cultura de Anahuac, the MCRCA, or the Mexicayot movement that was going on in Mexico. And there are Guatemalan elders that took a cue and purported this as well. Maya elders that there are books published with them saying these things. There are video interviews of them essentially saying that they say the Mayans came from the Pleiades, then to Atlantis, and then they taught the Egyptians, they taught the Chinese, and etc. They taught them civilization, and they had a utopia. Still racist, by the way. So, and again, I understand. I have a sympathy because I understand Guatemala was just coming out, is still recovering from a genocide. The Weenak political party that's headed by Rigoberta Menchú, she was the spokesperson of it. They still have people disappearing because they are political opposition. I understand that poverty may summon a desperation that, this may look attractive for the sake of feeding your family. But this is where the origins of these things come from. And I don't want to be like a party pooper. I bring these things up because there are actual indigenous traditions that are deep and high level. When I got together with people from different esoteric paths and I would tell them about these things, they're like, I know I did. Like, this is like next level stuff. And these are the esoteric traditions that have been considered the creme de la creme since the occult revival of the late 1800s. They thought they had it all figured out. And really, just how they thought Egypt is the land of the pyramids and really the Americas are. There's a whole world of metaphysics that it just offers so much to the world, and a new level of respect and beauty for Native peoples. And the more that we engage with these misconceptions and these pseudo spiritualities, it directly undermines legitimate forms of practice. Hunabku directly undermines the concept of duality. Ceremonial cacao, quote unquote, directly undermines Ishim. Culturally appropriated chakras directly undermines Maya Ishkoyopa. And this figure here that comes from the Codex Vaticanus B is a separate energetic system of 20 energy bodies that are a bit more ethereal, whereas the Koyopa corresponds to the joints. These correspond to the 20 day signs, but they have assignments to the body. This is a Mexica or Middle Mexico recorded codex, but the day signs, the conversion between the Mexica and Maya calendar is maintained by even like traditional authorities. So it is an educated assumption to roll like this is legit, or it is at least a fantastic starting point, because comparing to other esoteric traditions around the world, they have made mountains out of molehills worth of evidence that don't even compare to that. And crystal skulls directly undermine Yashtun, the green stone, jade. So I have for the idea of energy bodies, I have here this photo of Codex Vaticanus B. For Yashtun, I just love that knife. Thank you, Jade Maya, for making such an amazing jade utensil. Those crystal skulls remove focus from actual crystal magic of the Maya, which is jade. And quartz actually is pretty well used too. I mentioned the quartz slab is essentially like a proto ultrasound. And I find a better rendition instead of Hunabku, something that embodies that concept of duality better, is this figure from Western Guatemala that is dates back to the 600s classics period. La Ruta Maya Foundation, who has done presentations with IMS before, and stellar presentations, by the way. La Siamesa, the three-eyed figure. And there's so many three-eyed figures throughout Mesoamerica. These are better renditions of that concept of duality rather than Hunabku. And again, I have sympathy with those who had adopted it and then later became educated, and it was kind of too late once the ink needle hit or various Hunabku paraphernalia. Moving on, these are projects that I'm heading with. I will be starting what I'm calling the Mayan Mystery School, which has several objectives, which is to reconstruct lost ways with proper research, cultural immersion, and practice. Like, this is something that we practice. This isn't something that we just study. And I have no shade on anybody who simply studies. We need researchers. But there are people that are craving, especially in 2025, some kind of spiritual continuity. And this is a place that I will strive to be as honest as possible with all of the research and the correspondences, which you may not find elsewhere. This is to provide a think tank for alternative spirituality and religion, period. Encourage religious tolerance, period, especially in 2025. Provide a sense of community for serious spiritual seekers. Provide professional insights for esotericism. Support indigenous-led businesses. I'll show you an example in a second. To decolonize authentic Mesoamerican spirituality, which I think I've given you some good examples tonight. And halt decolonizing radicalization. And what I mean by that is this. I, too, have been a angsty, angry, a person that has been racially mistreated. But in 2025, with the political climate specifically focusing on people of Mesoamerican descent, we need to find unity with the parties that actually want to support us. That means people of various minorities. And again, I extend my thanks to the anthropological and archaeological community, because without your efforts, I would not have been able to reconstruct various rituals. And neither would my family have been able to do that. And I believe that going forward, we do need to find, if there's anything of the unity and not duality, is to find our similarities and also to celebrate our differences. Clearly, my father loved all the differences that my mother had. And he came from a place of fascination, not fetishization. And I want to see more of that in the world. The other reason why this is very important is especially with a big Pentecostal and Catholic rise in Mesoamerica, It's very sad to see people that are of native descent, very purely native descent, they get very cavalier and radically Christian to where they will physically attack people that they used to do spells with or they used to be of the culture with because they're not getting good answers to their questions. And again, many things in Mesoamerica are elder led, but like the Crystal Skulls example, sometimes they're asking questions and the elders, not all the elders, I want to stress that, not all the elders, but there have been some elders that have led seeking natives and seeking just seekers away because they can't give good answers. But you know who always has answers are radical, dogmatic fundamentalists of organized religion. I have an article on Substack called Timing the Antichrist and Totally Blowing It, of how I was picked up. Yeah, I grew up in this culture. I practiced spirituality, and my elders could not answer my questions. And I became a conspiratorial Christian. I write in that article about the consequences. And it wasn't just me. I was a part of a native group in my early adulthood, and we were all sent away because we had existential questions of which our elders could not answer for us. And it may simply be a lack of education. They're not reviewing archaeological and primary resources and new findings. Or they might be pushing things like crystal skulls and ceremonial cacao. And it can lead young indigenous people down very, very troubling roads. That's why I believe this is important. So part of my uh, efforts to legitimize Mesoamerican esotericism is that I'm investing in various projects with indigenous human art, no AI art for this. I am currently working with a few, and I want to work with more in the future for things that would resemble oracle decks, but I want them to be focusing on Mesoamerican correspondence, Mesoamerican numbers and numerology, not 78 cards to match the tarot or anything like that. I wanted to match Mesoamerican correspondences and Mesoamerican themes and mythology. So here on the far left, a beautiful rendition of La Siamesa from La Ruta Maya. This is by indigenous artist Arius, who is from central Mexico. He has a vast library of indigenous inspired art, and we're working together on a big project there. On the far right is a sketch by Mark Romero, who is of Nicaraguan descent, he has a vast library of Zapotec, Maya, and art inspired by the Chontales of Nicaragua. My partner, Elizabeth Empyrean, she's American, but I'm Maya, and we work together on this other project, this center glyph here of the hero twin Hunapu is a product of many that we have worked on together. Not pictured here, because we have yet to finalize a piece, is Luis Miguel Montes. He is an art professor who has taught at the University of El Salvador, where we will be adding the Pipil mythology to our projects, as well as addressing the rest of Mesoamerica. And that concludes my presentation. If you want more of me, if you want more of my findings, I am going to be hitting the content road really, really hard. You can, my Substack is solomonpakal.com, or you can just go on Substack and look for the Mayan Mystery Codex. That's the QR code if you want to scan off your phone. And thank you.
All right, Solomon, that was really, really, really nice. And did you invite Mark Romero here? He was here earlier and he gave me.
Yes.
Okay, I don't see that he's here now, but he was here earlier. And he was one of maybe 5 or 6 people that gave me their email addresses to sign up for the Aztlander. So I thank you for that. We do have a few questions and some nice comments in the chat. Joanne says, so brilliant, Solomon. Thank you for educating us on your traditions and culture. Lindsay says, have you noticed differences in the results and experiences when you go to the pre-Columbian original names?
Oh, absolutely. I think you would know. Uh, yes. If nothing else, here's the thing with practical esotericism. It is more than simply your mind. However, you are the conduit. You are like, I am talking to you through an interface, several interfaces, this laptop and camera. The interface to get the numinous through you is going to be your mind, some physical sensations, but primarily your mind. And if you have religious trauma, if you got something that like, even if you have a respect for Catholicism, which I do, but I can't go back to practicing that. Not after I've been essentially told I'm subhuman. So going back to the original names is most certainly much more powerful. Even my partner Elizabeth will attest to an Ectua ritual that we had done with my family last Dia de los Muertos, where some very, very like visceral, odd things were happening. Whereas, uh, like my mother had practiced with San Simon Mashimon for decades. But once we, thank you, Michael Groff, for the paper trail, it hit differently. The results of the practice exponentially increased to a ridiculous amount. So yes, I do believe that there is an added efficacy to trying to get to the source, like enriched uranium.
um, Douglas says he's on the edge of his seat, incredibly well spoken and presented. I would love to follow up with you. So would you want to give your email address out?
I say, follow me on Substack because then you can message me off of Substack, and that goes through email. It'll come out through email or the Substack app.
And do you want to say anything more about your book? Is Mayan Mystery Codex the name of the book?
No, the book that's going to be called Modern Mayan Magic. I think I'm allowed to announce it because I got my advance and I signed the contract. But it'll be out next year with Llewellyn Worldwide.
Okay. Uh, so anybody who's interested in the book, please keep in touch with me and the Aztlander, and I will certainly announce it when it comes out. Barb McLeod and Aaron Woolrich have been going back and forth, but I'll wait just a couple minutes more for that. Uh, Barb would like to know, do you identify God El as Ek Chual? Chual.
So in practice, I have found this is very inside baseball, but the God L, the guy with the pipe, there's a liquor named it's a tequila called El Fumador. It's got this, the famous God L mural of the elderly figure with the pipe. There is one rendition that is Ekchua, and then another translation is Alchua. And as a practitioner, they can, like Mashimon is like has 1,000 faces. They can kind of swap in and out of each other. Like again, this is inside baseball. I'm a practitioner, so it's like these divine personalities come out like that. But typically, for me, he is embodying that more elderly aspect. Um, my default, yes, is to call God El Ekchua. He responds to that name, and when I interact with this entity, it does not have uh, indicators of syncretism. It registers that syncretic history, but it is coming to me something much more native.
I would just let me just mention that I've had this conversation with Michael Groff myself rather extensively. He's a very, very close friend of mine, and I wish that he had come to this presentation, but I'll definitely make sure he watches the recording and gets on board. but I think he may have changed his views a little bit, perhaps through influence from me. I don't know, but I think that we may be looking at a case of very authentic Maya syncretism involving two elderly magicians, sorcerers from the classic period, one of whom we know as the jaguar god of the underworld, Ek Chua, and the other has carries the name of God En, but he is the other sorcerer, and his classic period name is basically as the sorcerer. Itzam, it means sorcerer, and that's the closest we can get to his original name. But the two of them are definitely aspects of the same force, if I may say, and so I think they both have a hand in, or they are both involved in the roots of Mashimon. So there's a lot more to be shared about that, I think, at some time.
That's amazing to hear. And I will just preface, so interacting with spirits is not necessarily like a Pokemon where like you call them and then they kind of stay like that. Sometimes they're very ethereal and ever shifting. This character, even if you don't believe in like all the stuff I'm saying, its history is very ethereal and shifting. All of the identities of Mashimo. He quite literally in one of the folklore legends is depicted with a mask on the backside of his head because he has 1,000 faces and can see everything. So this very slippery figure that has 1,000 masks, Ekchua, using the spirit mask as a way, again, practitioner speaking, to kind of condense the experience, but it is by no means a guarantee that it stays condensed. And I will say that like some of these spirit masks, they do tap into certain aspects rather than some of them tap into certain aspects of or different personalities of the same entity rather than like very distinguished characters. Another thing to keep in mind is that the various city-states, even of the classic period, had their own kinds of conceptions of some of these entities and that were slightly different than others. So which one am I calling upon from back then? Am I calling on I'm just going to say lack for better words, I might get this wrong, but like, am I calling on Kalak Mul's rendition of Chak? Or am I calling on Tikal's rendition of Ga'awil? And there's mythologies where Chak is very associated with Ga'awil. So which one am I calling upon? I am very procedural oriented. However, at some point you do gotta kind of like let it flow. And because you can't control the numinous. And that is where an element of where I do kind of like let the feedback hit me. But again, actually, like even if there's new discoveries about him, that is one that I am very comfortable with. Like, I'm not surprised. Like he's that kind of character. So, but that'd be amazing to hear. I'd love to hear Michael Groff's latest findings.
Sure.
All
I'll
right.
put you in touch.
Barb, did you want to mention anything about Canhel?
Not particularly. No, we had a little conversation. Aaron and I had a little conversation about where the term came from, and Aaron pointed out that Timothy Knowlton had suggested that it actually originates with arcángel, the Spanish word for archangel, which I think is actually probably the best etymology. My thought has been that it persists in that text and is repeated again and again as cangeles, cangelesob, because it overlays with another very Maya concept of the powers of the four directions. Kan being the word in Yucatec Maya for four, and Hel being the word for change or succession. And they do, under some circumstances, they trade off whoever is ruling at a given time. And so I thought that there might be something, a kind of syncretism there in the language that would perhaps allow both of them to be correct. But I'm not an authority on that particular topic, or not even on the Chilambalams either. I'm a student of them, and that's the best I can say. But I can read them in the original, which is something I've learned to do because I know the language.
Barb, you're looking good. Looks like you got a haircut.
I did.
And I hope you have recovered from all the knee ordeal.
Well, yeah, but then I've got to go through it again in October.
Huh.
I got the other knee that has to be done, but that's all right. I'm ready for it.
Carolyn Pete was here, and she's had both knees done, so she could give you some advice.
She's still here. Hi, Carolyn. You didn't do them both at the same time, did you?
No, she didn't.
No, I did not do them both at the same time.
God forbid.
No, yeah, absolutely. There is life after knee replacement.
Oh, boy.
No, I've discovered that my new knee is so much better than the other one now that I'm really
Yeah.
inspired. Yeah.
So Lindsay asked, would Yumtsil be an anthropomorphized version of the forces of nature, a facet of them that we interface with, or would it be seen as its own distinct entity, yet inextricably intertwined, part of that force as well? Solomon?
So with the UMC, because I see Alex asked basically a precursor to that as well. So Ku'u has a very convoluted history as well. And it is used by Maya as essentially some kind of ethereal, like divine kind of permeating force as well. But Yumsil is very much like how you interact with these things that can be courted. So in the Belizean Yucatec Maya tradition, they have certain rituals maintained to this day in the bush of talking to Yumchak for rain. And this is the Yumsil, whereas like and this changes upon region. Ku'u is, and this is probably a Catholic thing too. Ku'u is kind of like this prana sort of deal. Whereas the Yumsil is the kind of like the face that you would petition, more or less. If I was going to explain it with the best English language that I could, the Yumsilob, this plurality of God, or this plurality of the divine, again, existence itself, physical existence, is divine, or it is sacred in the Maya cosmology. So the Yumsilob are this thing that not only embodies nature, but it will be the thing that is beyond nature as well. A mini version is that one day the sun's going to explode, right? Or it's going to swallow us, but the sun's still going to be there. There's still going to be stars. That is from everything I have experienced, and I've cross-referenced this. Not all Maya agree, but enough due to where there's a lot of weight to the statement. Kinichahao persists even after the Earth is gone. Why? Because there are other stars. And when those stars die, if there will ever be another star, that will be Kinichao. Or it will, like, you could even say, like, the various Ek kind of personalities. But when you think this quintessential sun identity, it will outlast even us. And there's an element even of the numinous that outlasts the physical. The Popol Vuh and the Chilam Bilam mythos basically say that there is nothing to begin with, but there are the Yumsilop. Mm-hmm. So they are even beyond physical creation. There is this conceptual source of them. And we can interact with them through some kind of effigy, some kind of conduits, the spirit mass, for instance. So I can concentrate that in my interaction with that, but it's still a limited factor of what the Yumsil is. Ku'u, I think the ascription to Ku'u would say, like, okay, Chakas or Ku'u or something. I think that's more colonial based. And everything I've talked to with Belize Maya about Yumsil, it is much more of it's a really like conceptual understanding of what this is, of what these things are. That they will persist long after. They are not The humanoid aspects are for us to interact with, but it is not, they're not supermen, you know, they're not like this god beats up that god. Again, it's like there's various mythologies of you know, the maze god rising, defeating the underworld deity, and then the underworld deity defeating the maze god, or the sun descending into the underworld. These things are seasonal, just like anything in nature. And just like the Yumsi Lob, not one is like going to just one shot. Like if this was Pokemon or something, which organized religion and they kind of treat it as Pokemon. It's like my god's bigger than yours. I think in practice it is not that. Classic period, there was a bit more of that going on, right? But in actual practice, these things rotate in seasons, just like nature does, and the nature beyond nature.
You know, I want to acknowledge, thank you or whatever for mentioning Jose Arguelles, because for me personally, on page 29 of his Mayan Factor, where he mentioned the historical Quetzalcoatl was born on the day one read in the year one read, that's what started me off on my whole Maya thing. Like, how is my last name intertwined with of all personages, characters, Quetzalcoatl? And the Mayan Factor, I mean, I could understand the mathematics, and it was sort of like a Bible to me. But at the same time, I had, well, I did get to meet him by chance, hitchhiking along Big Sur in California. I had climbed down the cliffs and slept with the sea lions, and came up the next morning and was sitting on the guardrail and hitchhiking, and an indigenous man picked me up in an old pickup truck, and we had such an intense conversation. And he said, "There's someone I want you to meet." And we went back this road and we came to this house, all tree covered, no grass or lawn or anything like that. But anyway, he knocked on the glass sliding doors, and it happened to be the sliding glass doors of the bedroom of this man. And he got up out of bed with his then wife and came and opened the doors and let us in. And there was a beautiful painting. It was one of the big giant paintings that he was working on for his book of Earth Ascending. But anyway, I got to meet Jose Arguelles very early on. And I have one of the original 1000 dream spell kits, but I'll have you know that I opened the box and saw that it was a game, and I closed the box. And I've always advised people to don't get lost in the spell of the dream. And also Lenny Martin is here with us, and she and I were both big followers of Hunbat's Men back in the late 80s, early 90s, and Hunbat's Men at one time considered me a right-hand man, and I would bring groups to do ceremony with him. And I think Lenny was a part of his Mayan mystery tour. But Solomon, how do you often burn copal?
All the time. It's basically a non-negotiable. Bare minimum for my rituals are going to be this altar that has just put in a lot of work in with these ritual implements such as the masks, and the tables too are actually hand carved by an indigenous artist from Honduras from the 1950s. And copal incense is basically the non-negotiable to engage with at least the Yumsi Lop. If I'm doing ancestor work, that's like it's not absolutely necessary. It's an addition of where I come from. You bring a glass of water at the very least for ancestors, and for my abuela, any bottle of alcohol. So I think that's another thing that is so attractive about all the cacao craze right now, is that, and even Keith Wilson says it in his testimony, that the local Maya were using tobacco and alcohol for spiritual stuff. But that doesn't sell well in yoga studios in LA. People are about like healthy, vegan, gluten-free living, yada, yada, yada. And that's why cacao is very sacred, I'm sorry, it's very seductive to be like, okay, let's just treat this as like, we'll say it's ceremonial grade. And it's very funny. It's sad. There is a book by a specific Maya elder of which they mention nothing of cacao. And then there's things after a certain point that are all about it, that are associated with them. And ironically, the book came out in 2006 or 2007, after Keith Wilson really started this trend of introducing, not just because it wasn't just ceremonial cacao, he was introducing all kinds of appropriated practices such as kirtan, which is a poetry from Vedic cultures, like chocolate ecstatic dance is one of the things. So it's a lot of appropriated things, but it's all under the guise of it being health conscious. Even the tech bros see ayahuasca as a bit more health conscious than, say, definitely tobacco, that is for sure, or alcohol. But if my abuela was in charge and my abuela was running a Mayan mystery school, she wouldn't have a brand of cacao. She would have a brand of kusha, and maybe make a deal with Guile, the beer company. So, again, maybe that's just the more like craft culture that I come from. I mean, craft, I mean like that more like urban, what is called witchcraft, but like really the pre-Columbian precursors to these quote unquote witches and these nawals are these people that they stay up all night and they sleep during the day, and the trabajos is what they call their activities at night. That's where my family comes from. Not the more health conscious way. My abuela was not very health conscious.
I've asked Aaron Woolrich to unmute, but he hasn't done so yet. But he has a very long comment in the chat. My question is, the scholars Nancy Harris, Monroe Edmondson, who I've met and smoked cigarettes with, and Timothy Knowlton have all recognized Hunabku as an indigenous Maya, if not necessarily ancient conception, based on the appearance of the name in the Chilambalam text. So he's curious if you have any those lines of reasoning and why you think it originated with the Motu.
Oh, because they were pushing it in Chilambalam. Like there's mentions of Lucifer in Chilambalam. Like Chilambalam is obviously like it's a collection of different texts and whatnot. This was during the High Colonial Age, and they had different authors. If anybody doesn't know, it's like there's different authors within the lexicon of Chilambalam books, and some they were essentially like neighborhoods or towns. They were writing to represent their town. That's why you will find pro-Mayapan accounts in there, and you'll have like the two dynasties, the Shu dynasty and the Kokom dynasty, and they essentially had their pre-Columbian feuds. But those kinds of feuds made their way into the actual colonial writings of Chilambalam. I say that to say that there's just many differing opinions and many differing agendas in Chilambalam outside of simply colonizer and native. It's natives even against natives in there. Now, specifically the Hunabku thing, yeah, it is pressed upon the Maya people during this time. Even Moses is essentially has a correlation to one of the Powhatuns. So Chilambalam, I do not take it as like every single word is some kind of scripture. It is to be decoded. But Knowlton's work, particularly on the Ritual of the Creatures, is astounding of how it describes this, where it says like God came in the form of man. The one line that is repeated by this God that came in the form of man is, I am the corncob man. I am the corncob man. After a certain point of ascending the celestial spheres, he becomes, I am the flowering corn cob, or the corn cob flower, Kuin Bakal. If you look at the straight Maya translation, Kuin Bakal is one of the names for this corn flower blossoming. That is an example of something that is pre-Columbian, that is preserved. Then there's mixtures of it, because we talked about Kangel. The creature of Venus is called Alba Kangel. So some of these are, and it's not Spanish, it's a strange amalgamation of things. Here's the thing. If we look at it simply as, if we look at this as simply scholars, we kind of just like, I don't know, maybe like write it off. You take this as a practitioner and you cross-reference this with other esoteric traditions, they will tell you that there is value here, that there is a lot of ritual value in here. Even it's not even necessarily syncretism, because there, again, like there's so much in Knowlton's work. There's a lot of disses on the like disrespect on the Christian God in the ritual of the creatures. There is even kind of like one of the creatures tells the corn cob man, in this case Yum Ka'ash, or like the maize deity, that you may have done this, you may have ascended on your own, but nobody does anything on their own. That's the plurality of the Yum Silo. That's like when you're reading the beginnings of the Popol Vuh, that cooperation that is happening between creative forces. They're saying that, like, look, this Christian stuff is here, but this isn't the way it always was. You know how it actually is. I say that to just say that, yes, Chilam Bilam is filled with colonial mishmash stuff, because this was during the high atrocity period of colonization, and compromises clearly had to be made by the indigenous priests. And they, if I'm reading it too, like there's another ritual in there where it invokes Melchizedek and Adam, like Adam, the first man. But there's, as far as a ritual procedure, it is quite literally just a name drop. It is like when somebody just, like in these Marvel movies, does a cameo. It's not actually important, because they play no part in the ritual. Why mention, like, okay, here's Adam, here's Melchizedek, and then all of these strange mixes of indigenous Spanish words that are repeated. I am the corn cob man is mentioned more than elevating Moses or elevating Adam. Even all of the creatures, whether it's Decipto, that represents Mars, or Con la Mio, that represents Saturn. These are mentioned more and held in, they're clearly conveyed in higher reverence than even like Adam, Melchizedek, Lucifer, that is named dropped. So I think, and again, I can't speak for all of the indigenous writers at the time. They all had different agendas. But I believe that the author of the Ritual of the Creatures was trying to pass on some kind of indigenous ritual through time. And it is a mouthful, it is a headache to try and decipher. But that's being a historian. But I love the question. I do love the question. And so how it originated with the Motul dictionary, I believe, per my research, that it does predate, but I could be wrong with that. If I am wrong, I'm sorry, but like very close in dates, I think, those two.
You know, Aaron makes a comment about crystal skulls, but I think we've kind of, you covered that. But I remember back in the day, I think it was the Hedges skull, and the daughter brought it around to metaphysical shop tour, and they allowed you at the end to, if you wanted to touch your forehead to the crystal skull and receive a message or a vision, and I did so, but it didn't affect me at all. I mean, it only changed my sexuality and my whole outlook on the universe. No, I'm just kidding. I didn't feel a thing. But
let me, I will comment on that, though. I am not. Here's the thing: for as fooey as some of these things are, if enough people, this is as an esotericist and a practitioner speaking, if enough people focus on a certain object with enough of an intention, freaky things will happen. It's beyond the scope of this presentation, but look up the Philip experiment, or just study the entire chaos magic revolution that came out of Northern England in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s. There's a lot of strange, what are known as pataphysics or pataphysical anomalies that happens during that time period when you had essentially the remnants of the occult revival start experimenting with modern technology.
Right.
Well, I just wanted to add, though, that Aaron does make the point that there is an authentic Aztec tradition of crystal skulls. I saw one of those in Mexico City in the National Museum long, long ago, and there's no question of its authenticity, but it's the Mitchell Hedges skull, which is inauthentic, and for which he made up a false narrative, and that's the one that gained the most popularity, particularly leading up to 2012. And Hunbat's Men was one of the people that promoted it. In fact, I think at one point he was touring the U.S. with a collection of 13 crystal skulls, if I get the number right. Jim, you may know more about this. And I never attended any of those particular gatherings because the whole thing struck me as being pretty inauthentic and kind of unfair. And yet I understand the power of these things. If you gather enough people together with a focused intention, then that focused intention will make something change. That's kind of how magic works. And
Thank you, Solomon, for sharing your knowledge, wisdom, and life experiences. And thanks for watching this Aztlander presentation. And please subscribe to our YouTube channel. To subscribe to free monthly issues of the Aztlander, Magazine of the Americas, contact your host, Jim Reed, at jimreedmaya@gmail.com. Thanks again.